It's clear we live in a society. We are social creatures for the most part, so we want to ensure that the people around us aren't suffering needlessly. We don't want to see our neighbours struggling to make ends meet. And in the cases where they are struggling, we want to be able to do something to help them. The unexpected can always happen. And so there needs to be some kind of safety net in order to help people who find themselves in a precarious situation. It might be a precarious health situation, in which case they need some kind of medical care provided by the state, by the society in which they live. No one says that we shouldn't have state-funded roads, do they? The roads are there, built by the state, so that everyone can get from here to there faster than they otherwise would have. How much more important is the health of a society, the physical well-being of people? And for those people who can't afford to pay for their own healthcare because by virtue of accident, by genetic accident, they're going to be suffering cancer while someone else doesn't, just because of their DNA, why should they be punished? Why shouldn't the state step in to help them? Compassion and love means coming together as a group in order to identify the people who are at most risk in society, at risk of falling through the cracks. And so for this reason, we have things like welfare. We have benefits paid to people who are unemployed or who reach old age with insufficient savings, people who have a disability of some kind or other. We have these kind of safety nets, this social welfare payments by the state from people who can afford it, from people who are wealthy and who pay their taxes. To the extent they can afford, they pay more tax. And that tax money goes to those in their society who can't otherwise afford to meet their basic needs. For example, their healthcare. For example, even feeding themselves. And taxation is on a sliding scale. People on low incomes in a place like Australia pay nothing in taxes whatsoever. And the people on the highest incomes, they still don't pay too much. They pay more, however, than people on the lower end of the tax scale. But whatever the case, taxes are a net benefit to society. Taxes go to paying for the roads that already exist and to maintain those roads. They go towards things like hospitals and schools. They go towards police and the court system. Without these things, in particular the police and the court system, there would be anarchy, there would be chaos, there would be a society without institutions that maintain the stability required in order for us to make fast progress off into the indefinite future. In other words, we need at least some level of socialism. That much is obvious. All we're going to debate now is precisely how much socialism we need. The poorest among us need to be sustained in some way so that they can flourish. That might mean a minimum income. In the case of where they actually have a job, they need to be given a minimum wage. They shouldn't just be able to be paid anything by the employer that's seeking to employ them. The state needs to regulate and set a minimum wage, a minimum living wage, so that people can live at least somewhat comfortably. And for those who do not have work or cannot find work, then they're going to need to be given a minimum welfare check of some kind. They need to be able to have the freedom to go out and to buy the bare essentials they need, the food they need, the shelter, to put a roof over their head. They need to be able to clothe themselves so that they can eventually, hopefully, get to a job interview. So we need socialism to stop people from falling through the cracks. And you'll know this if you yourself have ever been a student, or you've been unemployed, or you've suddenly suffered severe sickness or some other kind of natural disaster where you need the state to step in, where socialism is required, where society comes together to help you. People who don't even know you, the taxpayers around you coming to help you, the state coming to help you. Socialism provides that net. And the term safety net should not be derided. It's important that people know and have the security of realizing that should the worst go wrong, then some entity will step in to help them. The state will step in. You are not alone. The state is able to help you. And the amount that the state gives to people isn't like they're going to become rich. It's just enough to meet their basic needs. This is why socialism is required, so that people can meet their basic needs in situations and circumstances where they otherwise wouldn't be able to, where they might otherwise die of starvation or die of serious illness. We need unemployment benefits so that when you don't have a job, you won't go hungry and starve to death. We need a minimum wage so that when you do have a job, you have enough to survive and perhaps even save some so that you can get out of that lowest income bracket and maybe save some money for a house. At this point, we should realise that it would be better if we taxed the top earners in society more than what we do, the top 1% as we talk about, or the top 0.001%. If we just talk about the most wealthy people in the United States, it's often said we should tax them more, and then we could pay for so much more. The United States, for example, could have free healthcare for everyone. And sometimes this is straw man. This is straw manned by saying, well, people who claim this, if we were to just tax the top 100 earning billionaires in the USA somewhat more, then we could pay for universal healthcare and perhaps a universal basic income. Well, the straw manning of this is that people don't realise what we're really talking about is not just taking the personal income of these people, but taking a little bit of the revenue of the top companies, the top earning companies across the United States. I mean, look at this table. Look at how much money companies like Walmart and Amazon, just to name the top two, are earning. That amount of revenue, if it was taxed at a higher rate than what it is, would easily provide enough money for universal basic income and universal healthcare across the country. Why not do this? This is not only about economics. This is about morality. What we need to do is to have more compassion in society. We need to consider people who can't make ends meet at times, who can't find the healthcare they need, who can't afford the healthcare they need, and who can't afford the food they otherwise need. This is why we need a welfare state. This is why happiness is very strongly coupled to how socialist a country is. And this is why we need to defend socialism. It's clear we live in a society. We are social creatures for the most part, so we want to ensure that the people around us aren't suffering needlessly. Who can disagree with that? It's a strange impulse that people have that if you were to object to the first part, namely that we live in a society typically, and scientifically speaking, we're social creatures, even if there are a whole bunch of people who aren't particularly social, they're called introverts. It's a strange impulse to then think that if you don't endorse socialism, that you're unconcerned about the suffering of others. This debate about socialism versus other ways of organising society, and particularly economic systems, that people on one side of the debate don't care about the suffering of people or care less about the suffering of people. Maybe they've thought through the logic of the situation, which is what I want to try and do today, to try and think through the logic of how best to help the most number of people. This isn't necessarily a utilitarian argument, but if you begin with certain ideas, certain explanations about how people behave and about how knowledge is created and therefore how wealth is created, maybe you will find that pursuing particular ways of trying to get the most number of people, the most wealthy you possibly can, will lead to a dead end. Whereas on the flip side, if you've thought your entire life that the only way to help the most number of people is for everyone to join together into a collective and help each other, rather than for everyone to pursue their own happiness and their own ends, we don't want to see our neighbours struggling to make ends meet. And in the cases where they are struggling, we want to be able to do something to help them. Again, no matter what your economic perspective, it's independent of whether or not you want to help other people or not. There can be socialists who don't care about helping other people. And there can be capitalists who really do care about helping other people. One thing that many people who identify as capitalists are concerned about when it comes to socialism is that it takes away from them the very real opportunity they would otherwise have to help someone. Instead, it's handed away to the state. And the state is an entity, but it's not a thinking thing. It doesn't actually have compassion. And this is the really worrying aspect of things, that if you hand over to an entity which lacks compassion because it's not capable of having compassion, it's, after all, just an entity, it's not an individual person, only individuals can have compassion, then it will deal with people in a way which is not compassionate. On the other hand, if you enable individuals to help one another, they will have compassion one for another, and they can show kindness one to another. The unexpected can always happen. And so there needs to be some kind of safety net in order to help people who find themselves in a precarious situation. It might be a precarious health situation, in which case they need some kind of medical care provided by the state, by the society in which they live. No one says that we shouldn't have state-funded roads, do they? Well, actually, some people do. Some of us recognise that the state-funded roads are particularly poorly kept. And if you compare them to the toll roads, the privately funded roads, those privately funded roads work so much better. The only thing is that these roads have been grandfathered in, so to speak. The roads that were built by the state precisely because, and maintained by the state precisely because, they insisted that no one else build roads. They insisted on total control of the roads. And so they passed laws saying they are the only entity able to build the roads, except in certain situations these days where great freeways are made that are private and you have to pay a toll to go onto those roads. There's absolutely no reason why this day and age of technology and Google Maps, you couldn't have entirely private roads. And you would pay for the roads to the extent that you drove on them and actually utilised them, or use some sort of transportation that went along them, whether that's walking or riding a bike or driving your car or catching a bus. And then people would be interested in maintaining the roads that they use every day. And the roads that get used more often would end up having more income put into them if they were privately owned and maintained far better than the roads that barely ever got used, which of course wouldn't need as much maintenance. Whatever the case, this so-called public goods issue, the idea that there are certain things out there in society that, by virtue of the fact that we've always done it this way, need to continue to be always done this way, is a silly idea of looking at any form of innovation. That just because the road is there built by the government doesn't mean it needs to be forever owned by the government and maintained by the government. There are entities out there more creative and better suited at looking after things like roads than the government is. The government, as I like to say, is expert at almost nothing except the use of force. That's about it. The roads are there, built by the state, so that everyone can get from here to there faster than they otherwise would have. How much more important is the health of a society, the physical well-being of people? And for those people who can't afford to pay for their own healthcare because by virtue of accident, by genetic accident, they're going to be suffering cancer while someone else doesn't, just because of their DNA, why should they be punished? Why shouldn't the state step in to help them? One reason is, in the counterfactual world, the alternative world, in Australia we do have this so-called universal healthcare, but in an alternate world where we didn't have universal healthcare and we actually pay something called the Medicare levy, we pay normal tax, which is quite substantial, and then on top of that we pay the Medicare levy, so everyone actually pays a separate amount of tax. It's about 2% of your usual income, of your overall income, just for the purpose of having health care. And so that is some number of thousands of dollars per person per year. Now, if people weren't paying that, for example, if I wasn't paying that every single year, I certainly do not consume in costs all of those thousands of dollars that I pay to the government for Medicare, for the universal healthcare each and every year. I go nowhere near that. I also have private health insurance as well as paying the Medicare. Everyone in Australia pays the Medicare. But if they didn't pay the Medicare, that money could go into savings. That money could go into private healthcare. So everyone would be much more wealthy, much more able to invest in their own healthcare to the extent that they require it. And one may say, well, what about the situations where you are confronted with a vast cost for your healthcare? You're involved in a traffic accident, or you have cancer and you need very expensive treatments. Again, this comes down to private healthcare, and private healthcare would be far more affordable in the case where people don't contribute so much money in taxation to the government if they're able to keep it for themselves? What about people who still can't afford it? This already happens, by the way. There are many, many situations where, even with universal healthcare, people still end up requiring treatments that are experimental or that the government simply doesn't fund, or that Australia, for example, isn't able to provide, and people have to travel overseas, for example, to the United States in order to get particular treatments. And in those cases, what happens is we have charities, we have GoFundMes, and these things are actually very effective. And they require no coercion, no force. People just announce that they need particular treatments, particular healthcare that the government isn't providing, and the generosity of the society in which they find themselves reveals itself through the voluntary donations towards these crowd-funded things. One may say, well, why should people have to do that? Why, isn't it demeaning that a person has to do that? I don't think so. Wasn't it Jesus who said, "Ask and you shall receive"? People should be willing to have gratitude for the people that help them. If the state is merely providing things, very few people who receive healthcare ever thank the people in society who've paid the taxes in order for them to receive that healthcare. At least in this situation of voluntary donations, the person actually can show their gratitude to specific people who have helped them. It concentrates both the compassion and the gratitude. This is good for a society. Whereas if you disperse and dilute both the gratitude and the compassion, no one seems to care about anyone else. And this is a bad thing. Compassion and love means coming together as a group in order to identify the people who are at most risk in society, at risk of falling through the cracks. And so for this reason, we have things like welfare. We have benefits paid to people who are unemployed or who reach old age with insufficient savings, people who have a disability of some kind or other. We have these kind of safety nets, this social welfare payments by the state from people who can afford it, from people who are wealthy and who pay their taxes. To the extent they can afford, they pay more tax. And that tax money goes to those in their society who can't otherwise afford to meet their basic needs. For example, their healthcare. For example, even feeding themselves. It's interesting I began that part of the defence of socialism with this idea of love and compassion. A loving and compassionate society would ensure that people don't fall through the cracks. But in fact, as I've also said, compassion and love are the very things that are distilled out of a socialist society. There is no such thing as a compassionate society. There are compassionate individuals. And if you take away the capacity of an individual to go and help another individual, then there is no compassion there. All that's happening is that a government, which again is made up of systems and institutions incapable of loving, incapable of showing compassion. What those things do is merely enact processes, enact legislation and regulations. That's all that's going on. It's a big unthinking machine. It's the difference between artificial intelligence, a regular computer that is unthinkingly going about its business, the wheels and the cogs are turning, the transistors are on or off, and an actual person who is thinking and feeling, deliberating and considering the extent to which they're going to show compassion or not show compassion. That person is deserving of their charity or not deserving of their charity, because the person giving the charity either has sufficient wealth to share it around or not. What the state does is take away that love and compassion. It takes away the capacity of the individual who might not have enough money to actually sacrifice to some extent. Now, I'm not for sacrifice, but at least a person has a choice in the situation where the state hasn't removed the choice from them. There are many people just below the threshold at which, if only they were above the threshold, would be giving charity far more frequently. But they can't give to charity more frequently precisely because the government has taken away much of their money through taxation. Socialism, therefore, is not compassionate. It is the opposite of compassionate. It is cruel by the imposition of systems and regulations on people who otherwise would be able to show generosity, charity, and compassion. And taxation is on a sliding scale. People on low incomes in a place like Australia pay nothing in taxes whatsoever. And the people on the highest incomes, they still don't pay too much. They pay more, however, than people on the lower end of the tax scale. But whatever the case, taxes are a net benefit to society. Taxes go to paying for the roads that already exist and to maintain those roads. They go towards things like hospitals and schools. They go towards police and the court system. If the government could run things really efficiently and really well, then the logical conclusion one should reach is that they provide almost everything in society. For example, equally as important as healthcare is food. Why doesn't the government distribute food? Forget McDonald's, forget your local supermarket, forget the local Chinese takeaway. Have the government deliver food to people. Food is very, very important after all. As important as healthcare. You have no health if you don't have any food. Why don't we do this? Because it's quite obvious that private enterprise, the free exchange of goods between people, works far more efficiently in a society where people are freely able to exchange goods, and you end up with more food in such a society. You end up with much more food production in society and much more consumption in a society where there is the free exchange of money for food. Repeat for mobile phones, repeat for cars, repeat for air travel, and etc. But there are certain things where people say, oh no, the government is better at this particular thing. For example, healthcare is the one that comes up most frequently, and roads as well. As I've already said, I think the roads that are private end up being a lot better maintained than the roads that aren't. The healthcare one is very contentious. And the reason the healthcare one is contentious is, as many people have observed, it's mainly an issue in the United States. And it's mainly an issue in the United States because there is not universal healthcare there. And they have a less regulated pharmaceutical industry. And it is true, the United States subsidizes the rest of the world's pharmaceuticals. This is simply a fact. The pharmaceutical companies that are there in the United States are able to develop, experiment, and research new drugs, new medicines, and then sell those to the most wealthy market in the world, which is the United States. And the United States, happily for the moment, at least to some extent, not as much as it should be able to, is able to sell those drugs and make a profit so that they can then put that money back into research to make new drugs. For example, COVID vaccines. Other countries have governments that make regulations on the cost of medicines. I know Australia does. Australia makes deals with pharmaceutical companies such that the drugs can come into the country, the medicines can be imported into our country, but at a specific price point. And that price point is just enough so that the profit margin is very, very, very slim for any drugs that are imported into Australia. Because Australia, the Australian government, being a huge market, is able to demand that. Now, of course, the pharmaceutical companies could turn around and say, no, we're not going to sell you any pharmaceuticals at that price. But then, of course, their reputation and their marketing looks terrible. The Australian government says, well, the company has refused to sell us those drugs. So the pharmaceutical companies make very little money. They make some, but they make very little money by selling their new drugs, especially the new drugs, to places like Australia. But they make good money in the United States, or at least better money. This is unfair. It would be far better if the drug market was largely unregulated, which is largely what happened, by the way, with these COVID vaccines. A lot of the regulations were dropped so that there was natural competition arose and very fast development, faster than ever happened before, because the regulations were removed. I know some people, strangely enough, the people that are on the more conservative side of the aisle, are worried about the fact that some of these drugs were pushed through very quickly. But in fact, that's a good thing. It's better that they didn't have to go through so many trials and be so heavily regulated, as almost all other pharmaceuticals are. The regulation of the pharmaceutical industry is a travesty. We can see that now, that when the stakes are high for a global pandemic emergency, such as the COVID-19 emergency, we had fast development of vaccines, and these companies were able to make profits. Regulations slow things down, and the government is not sufficiently expert in being able to determine the efficacy of something or other, the safety of something or other. They have some scientists, they have some doctors, but they're not necessarily the best. They don't necessarily know what they're doing better than the people who work in those industries, who are actually at the front line. Without these things, in particular the police and the court system, there would be anarchy, there would be chaos, there would be a society without institutions that maintain the stability required in order for us to make fast progress off into the indefinite future. So I agree, there is one exception to the rule here. We need to have a state apparatus that includes police to maintain, as I say there, stability while undergoing great change. Rapid progress is something that has only happened over the last few centuries, and it's only happened in places which have robust institutions steering society carefully within the guardrails that would otherwise, if they weren't there, cause chaos and anarchy. So we need courts to settle disputes. We need police to have a monopoly on violence. We need a military to protect ourselves from those other countries which are not stable in the way that we are stable. If everyone was perfectly reasonable all of the time, if they were just using their reason, then we would never get into a situation where the threat of force ever arose. We would simply talk it out indefinitely. We would use our reason all the time. And in that case, we could indeed have an anarcho-capitalist society. But in that case, in this anarcho-capitalist society, we wouldn't even need private security, because everyone would be using their reason all the time. But in a situation where force is actually used sometimes, when a dispute arises, sadly, then we need a monopoly on violence. And if we don't have a monopoly on violence, if we have a private industry of competing police forces, as the anarcho-capitalists say that we could have, then you've got warfare. This is effectively the difference between one state actor and another state actor, where everyone has their own little fiefdoms and people go to war. This is not good. So to me, anarchy is kind of like the abstract ideal which can never possibly be reached. The ideal where everyone always and only ever uses their reason all the time, and there is never a possibility of force because people simply don't even consider it. That's not the situation we're in. It's not the situation we're going to be in for the foreseeable future. I cannot imagine a scenario in which people always, forever use their reason, because I think we humans are error-prone. And reason is that very thing which corrects errors. And we're never going to be without errors to correct. If we were without errors to correct, then I grant we could have an anarcho-capitalist society. But we're not there. We're not going to get there anytime soon, and so therefore we need a monopoly on violence. We need a state police force, and so therefore we need a court system to settle disputes between the citizens and the police, and we need a government of some kind setting the laws that will determine how the courts are going to arbitrate disputes. And of course, one hopes all three of these things are utterly independent one from another, or as independent as you possibly can have them be. The government and the courts and the state apparatus and the police all acting according to law, but not easily influenced by the power of each other. We don't want the courts being influenced by the government, who are using the police to intimidate them, for example, and we don't want the police to be intimidating the government, certainly not, and we don't want the courts constantly telling the government what to do either. In other words, we need at least some level of socialism. That much is obvious. All we're going to debate now is precisely how much socialism we need. The poorest among us need to be sustained in some way so that they can flourish. That might mean a minimum income. In the case of where they actually have a job, they need to be given a minimum wage. They shouldn't just be able to be paid anything by the employer that's seeking to employ them. The state needs to regulate and set a minimum wage, a minimum living wage, so that people can live at least somewhat comfortably. That there is a classic slippery slope argument. And the slippery slope is real. It's very real. I concede many people who regard themselves as free marketeers, free market capitalists, or just capitalists, libertarians, whatever. Those of us who concede, yes, we need a government. Yes, we need a police force. Yes, we need the courts. I'm not arguing for socialism. That's not socialism. These are essential components of a capitalist society so that we can preserve the free trading of people one amongst the other without coercion, without having coercion in that system. So when I begin there by saying, if we admit that we need to have government-funded police forces, then therefore we admit that we need some level of socialism. Therefore, we're just talking about degrees of socialism. So now let's talk about how much money to give the unemployed and the poor. This is the wrong way to think about it. Capitalism requires that there is a monopoly on violence. Capitalism requires that there are rules of the game, and the rules of the game can be enforced. By what? By the police, under the direction of courts, implementing laws that the democratic system, the legislators, representing the people, have decided the rules of the game should be. This is not socialism. And by the way, many of us, of course, think that in the distant future, not as far away as the ideal anarchic system where everyone's using reason all the time, but certainly in the not too distant future, we could have a situation where society is so wealthy that tax rates fall almost to zero, because the only thing that we would be funding in such a near to ideal world, a near to ideal capitalist society, is all we need to fund are police and courts and the government. And when I say the government, I mean literally the parliament or the Congress. That's all we need. And the cost of these things then becomes minimal, even for the military. And in that case, you then have a situation where you really can have voluntary taxes. This is a long way off into the future. Many people might think this is fantasy talk, and for now it is. But give it time, okay? We are so much more wealthy today than what we were 100 years ago compared to 1,000 years ago. We're becoming healthier, wealthier, wiser, and off into the distant future we'll have less and less and less coercion. And the logical outcome of that less and less and less coercion in society is the capacity to have very minimal taxation, and indeed voluntary taxation off into the distant future. None of this is an argument for socialism. And for those who do not have work or cannot find work, then they're going to need to be given a minimum welfare check of some kind. They need to be able to have the freedom to go out and to buy the bare essentials they need, the food they need, the shelter to put a roof over their head. They need to be able to clothe themselves so that they can eventually, hopefully, get to a job interview. The freedom to go out there and to buy the food they need, to get the job they need. In a system which is a socialist system, which has things like minimum wage, this means that if you are unemployed, and I've been unemployed before, but it means that there are certain deals as an unemployed person you can't make. It's illegal for you to make. You can't turn up to someone and say, will you pay me $5 per hour to clean your house? You're not allowed to do that because there's a minimum wage that cleaners need to be paid. But if someone needs their house cleaned, but they're not a very wealthy person, and they cannot afford the minimum wage, let's say the minimum wage for a house cleaner is $12 per hour, but they can't pay $12 per hour. So what do? They clean their own house. Okay, and so they waste their time cleaning their own house when they could be doing something better. If they could pay half that amount, $6 per hour, then they could easily find a cleaner to do it. So what the minimum wage does is it actually means that some people are not able to be employed. And of course, minimum wage puts up costs for everyone. If you have a minimum wage on delivery drivers, well, that's going to be passed on to the consumer who buys the food. A minimum wage for wait staff is going to cause the price of food in the restaurant to go up. They need to be able to have the freedom to go out and to buy the bare essentials they need. So as to freedom, they're not free actually they're far less free. They're not free to get the job that they might otherwise want. And of course, aside from minimum wage, we have unemployment benefits. And we should observe here that in Australia, for example, these unemployment benefits are of such an amount that people can survive on them. It depends on where you are. If you're in Sydney, then you're really going to struggle to find a house which your unemployment benefits will enable you to pay the rent, pay for your food, pay for your transport, all that sort of thing. Indeed, it's going to be quite a low wage. Indeed, the amount of benefits that you get from the government is going to be too low for you to exist in a place like Sydney. But you only have to go a few tens of kilometres out of Sydney, maybe 100, maybe 150, and you will find places where the rent is far cheaper and where you will be able to survive, at least in a share house or something like that, until such time as you find a job. Of course, people don't want to do this quite often. People want to be paid by the government a sufficient amount so that they can live wherever they want, eat the kind of food they want. But this just means that they're not motivated to get a job and do something productive with their life. So we need socialism to stop people from falling through the cracks. And you'll know this if you yourself have ever been a student, or you've been unemployed, or you've suddenly suffered severe sickness or some other kind of natural disaster where you need the state to step in, where socialism is required, where society comes together to help you. People who don't even know you, the taxpayers around you coming to help you, the state coming to help you. If people weren't taxed so much in the first place, they could build up a bank of savings such that if they suddenly did lose their job, then they would have something to fall back on to tide them over until such time as they were able to get another job. As for being a student, well, if you're living at home with your parents, then most of your costs are being met anyway. When I was a student, I was working simultaneously while being a student. I think this is less common for some reason these days. As for getting sick, the same argument applies as I was saying earlier. If you weren't taxed so much in the first place, you could build up a bank of savings in order to prepare for that rainy day, or at least to be paying to private health insurance. There's also unemployment insurance that people can get as well. As to natural disasters, yes, this is a place where the state sometimes steps in. In Australia, we have something called the State Emergency Service, so that when there is a huge storm or a flood or a drought or a fire, the State Emergency Service can step in. But these people are largely working voluntarily. And so volunteers, the society comes together under those times of crises to help one another out without needing to be paid, largely speaking, by the state. Socialism provides that net. And the term safety net should not be derided. It's important that people know and have the security of realising that should the worst go wrong, then some entity will step in to help them. The state will step in. You are not alone. The state is able to help you. You're not alone in either case. You don't need the state to step in. When the worst happens, and this is clear to us almost every single year, at least here in Australia, advertisements appear on the television around about Christmas time, talking about the Salvation Army, for example, and various other charities who are there to help people during those times when they're going without and it might be a difficult time for them. So the state doesn't always step in anyway. And once more, if people weren't already taxed so much, then they would have the capacity to be more generous with the money that otherwise they're giving away to the state. Not giving away, that is being taken from them by the state. The state is spending money in a way that it deems fit, rather than the way in which the individual deems fit. I'm a strong advocate for working locally. So that if you see homeless people in your locale, then you should definitely help them. I think that's an important thing that you can do within your own community, and it builds a sense of community as well. Even with strong social welfare programs, such as Australia has, we still have homeless people. I think almost every country in the world has some kind of homeless problem, or people in need, people unemployed, people who can't work. And the state isn't particularly good at solving that problem. Charities are, however, because then people work one-on-one. It's not some bureaucrat who has very little interest in the person in front of them. So some entity will indeed step in. It doesn't need to be the state, however. It's preferable that it's neighbours, that it's charities, that it's people who know, personally, the people in need. In many, many cases, this is family and friends. And this, by the way, is an argument for a strong family connection, such that when you are in trouble, if you have this strong family unit, then the state isn't needed at all in the first place. The family will help out. And then friends can help out. And in those situations where, unfortunately, someone doesn't have family and friends, you have charity. The whole point of statism and socialism is to devalue the family, to denigrate these smaller, more local connections, and to dilute the networks, the local networks, in favour of this grand overarching state apparatus at a very high level, to make the family seem less important. That in fact what you need to be able to look to state officials for help. And the amount that the state gives to people isn't like they're going to become rich. It's just enough to meet their basic needs. This is why socialism is required, so that people can meet their basic needs in situations and circumstances where they otherwise wouldn't be able to, where they might otherwise die of starvation or die of serious illness. No one is dying of starvation in a place like Australia. No one is dying of starvation in a place like the United States unless something has gone severely wrong with the family, friends, and local community. It's not up to the federal government in any of these wealthy nations to be ensuring that people do not starve. This problem has long since been solved. As for people dying because they're not getting sufficient medical care, that happens within countries like Australia anyway, even with so-called universal healthcare. It happens. People die. Sometimes treatments are too expensive even for the state, but people should have private health insurance. And where private health insurance can't be afforded, people can get loans. And as I said, people can seek donations and get charity. All of this, anyway, is a moot point in a more wealthy society. And a more wealthy, healthy, productive society happens when you tax people less, when you stop confiscating their wealth, when you allow them to make decisions about their money better than the state can, by, for example, investing it in such a way that they make even more money and are even more resilient to problems like bad health when it happens. We need a minimum wage so that when you do have a job, you have enough to survive and perhaps even save some so that you can get out of that lowest income bracket and maybe save some money for a house. At this point, we should realise that it would be better if we taxed the top earners in society more than what we do, the top 1% as we talk about, or the top 0.001%. If we just talk about the most wealthy people in the United States, it's often said we should tax them more, and then we could pay for so much more. The United States, for example, could have free healthcare for everyone. And sometimes this is straw man. This is straw manned by saying, well, people who claim this, if we were to just tax the top 100 earning billionaires in the USA somewhat more, then we could pay for universal healthcare and perhaps a universal basic income. Well, the straw manning of this is that people don't realise what we're really talking about is not just taking the personal income of these people, but taking a little bit of the revenue of the top companies, the top earning companies across the United States. People move between tax brackets. The top 1% and the top 0.1% isn't the same year on year and decade after decade and generation after generation. That's simply not true. When I first got a job, I was absolutely in the minimum tax bracket. I wasn't paying any tax. And then I gradually moved through the tax brackets. I'm still not in the highest tax bracket, but people are so-called upwardly mobile. They move between tax brackets. Sometimes you move down, sometimes you move up. As for taxing this top 0.1%, yes, even if you did tax them most of their income, 90% or something, it would be a drop in the ocean in terms of trying to fund universal healthcare for the United States. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and the next 98 wealthiest billionaires in the United States go nowhere near having enough money to fund universal healthcare across the United States. It's nowhere near the amount that's required. As for taxing the revenue, now if your ears didn't prick up when I said revenue and immediately spot an error, then you should rethink how much you understand about issues like economics. Revenue is simply how much money you've taken in, without regard to what your costs are. What people are really interested in is, of course, profit. They want to tax profits. But I don't know, as I've said before, how a complicated company, let's say like Amazon, actually works. What they do with their profits exactly. I know to some extent they're constantly innovating. They're finding new ways to get things from producer to them, distributor, to the customer, to the person who's buying the stuff. They're using drones and all sorts of things now in order to do this. If you take away their profits, you'll take away some of their capacity to innovate, their capacity to produce better services and better products, the capacity to create more knowledge about how to create more wealth and make things better for everyone. The mere existence of Amazon has made so many people's lives better. Walmart is the same thing. These companies provide competition for whatever was there before those companies existed. People like to complain that some of these vast companies are as if they're monopolies, but that's simply wrong. They have competed and continue to compete with many other corporations. When it comes to a corporation like Google that has vast profits, people say it's a monopoly. It's not. There are other search engines out there. And by the way, what it did was compete away so many other alternatives that weren't as good. There's no reason why someone can't create something that tomorrow is an even better service or search engine than what Google is. But if you start to regulate, that's a perfect way. Or if you start to tax away their capacity to innovate, that's a perfect way to ensure that no new competitors enter the market, because those new competitors that otherwise would have entered the market are now subject to the same regulations and the same level of taxation. And it makes it all the more hard or more difficult for that new competitor to enter the market. Big corporations often do like regulation, by the way, because it does keep their competitors at bay. If something like Google is regulated or Facebook is regulated, for example, then this means that they can wheel and deal with the government. They can wheel and deal with the state, with the politicians, with individual politicians. They can lobby for the particular regulations they want. This is what happens. So that when the regulations are implemented, they're implemented in such a way that it is unfavourable for any competitor to try and enter the market. I mean, look at this table. Look at how much money companies like Walmart and Amazon, just to name the top two, are earning. That amount of revenue, if it was taxed at a higher rate than what it is, would easily provide enough money for universal basic income and universal healthcare across the country. Why not do this? This is not only about economics. This is about morality. What we need to do is to have more compassion in society. We need to consider people who can't make ends meet at times, who can't find the healthcare they need, who can't afford the healthcare they need, and who can't afford the food they otherwise need. This is why we need a welfare state. This is why happiness is very strongly coupled to how socialist a country is. It is about morality. It is about morality. But morality is not primarily about compassion. Compassion is part of it, but what it's mainly about is not using coercion, not forcing someone to do something they don't want to do against their will, trying to remove their capacity to reason and to create knowledge in a particular area. If someone needs help, then the compassionate thing is to allow people around them to decide the extent to which they can help. And in many cases, they will be able to help quite a lot. And when they do, isn't that wonderful? They get to demonstrate their compassion, and the person knows who's helping them and can be grateful for the help. I've been grateful for help before from people, but if the state steps in, which person, which individual is the person being helped supposed to be grateful to? Everyone? Not really, because not everyone pays tax after all. They've got no one to thank. Maybe you think that's a good thing. Isn't it good they don't have to thank anyone? I happen to think it's a bad thing. I think that when someone receives something for nothing, then this isn't good. This is a one-way transaction. Someone has given away something, a whole bunch of people in society, in this particular case when we're talking about welfare payments, whole people have given away stuff, and that person that receives it doesn't know who's giving it to them. It's a one-way transaction. The person giving away the stuff doesn't actually even feel good about it because they haven't willingly given it. I don't willingly give my tax away. I would happily, willingly give some of my money to someone in front of me who needs help. And I think almost everyone else is the same. What socialism does is it takes away this opportunity, this personal interaction, this capacity for us to help each other far more than what we do. This is the danger of these kind of memes that say, leave it to the state, to this system, to this legislation, this unthinking machine whose wheels and cogs are going to grind away, and some people will be helped and other people won't. And the system doesn't care. It doesn't have the capacity to care, unlike individuals do. And this is why we need to defend socialism. Well, I have called this video a defense of socialism. And if you think this is unfair, that I have somehow tricked you, maybe you expected the trick after all, it is me. I would say that I'm genuinely defending socialism here. This was my best attempt at steelmanning socialism, steelmanning what I've heard in terms of arguments for socialism and what I've believed in a previous lifetime about socialism. That it is supposedly the compassionate thing, and in some cases it's the only way of doing things and the best way of doing things. But now I don't think that. This is a genuine defense of socialism. But as Popper would implore us, defending something isn't showing something is true. I've provided all the supporting arguments I can for socialism. I don't think any of them are valid. What we need instead is to have a way of distinguishing one explanation from another. We have a problem situation. Our problem situation is how to ensure that we create as much wealth for as many people as we possibly can. This is one way of framing the problem. Another way of framing the problem is to say, how can we enable as much creativity as we possibly can? Because problems will be encountered in the future for which we don't have solutions right now, obviously. And we're going to need to find those solutions as rapidly as possible if we don't want to go extinct. What is the way in which we can best create the conditions such that we are a problem-solving society that can rapidly solve problems? One way is to ensure that we can maximize the amount of wealth in society. And the way to do that is to maximize the amount of wealth that each individual can generate and create. This is not done best by socialism. One of the ways to slow down progress, to slow down wealth creation and knowledge creation and creativity, broadly speaking, is to have regulations, is to take away money from some people, indeed the people who produce the most, and give it to the people who produce the least. And to have less motivation for those people who produce the least to actually increase the amount of productivity they have, and to actually demotivate the people who are producing the most by taking away so much of their hard-earned wealth. In a truly progressive, by which I mean a society which values genuine progress, scientific progress, philosophical progress, mathematical progress, economic progress, progress across all areas enables the individual to flourish to a maximum extent within the confines of a society which has robust institutions which allow for us to make this rapid progress while maintaining stability. But what it does not require are huge amounts of coercion and force, the redistribution of wealth from the most productive to the least productive. This is my defense of socialism. The defense of socialism does not stand up against the criticisms from capitalism. The capitalist theory is a critique of socialism, and this critique is an absolutely perfect refutation of socialism. The best defense of socialism cannot stand up against the critiques of capitalism, the critiques of the way in which wealth is actually generated. We generate wealth best by being free to explore the space of possibilities in terms of innovation and creating knowledge and building wealth. Being able to build something which then you can show to the other people in society, and they can say, wow, there's a lot of value in that. I want a piece of that. I want to buy that product, participate in that organization, employ your services. When people are maximally allowed to do that, and people are allowed to keep the earnings from being creative to the greatest extent that they can, then everyone's boat rises with the same tide. And where, as the socialists are concerned, people do actually fall by the wayside to some extent through misfortune, through accident, through ill health, through unemployment, etc., then the rest of society is so much more wealthy and so much more ready to be generous that you don't need a state apparatus to step in. Less and less do you need that, because the individuals in that society are so much more wealthy. And the more wealthy people get, the more generous they get. The United States is very wealthy, but it also gives more charity than anyone else. So there's my defense of socialism. A defense doesn't mean that I agree with it. In fact, I don't. I disagree with it strongly. And even the best defense sometimes isn't good enough.